circumstances. There's something left to find. So I find this ancestor, and in one census document she's named Easter, and one she's named Esther, and one she's born in Maryland in 1769, Esther Lowe. Someone sent me another document that's probably heard last week that I haven't even really been able to process. She says to them, well, they call me Esther, but my real name is Stace. And I just loved it. Because you think about, yes, I'm going to admit the conditions under which I am held captive, and I'm also going to tell you, call me by my right name. Mm-hmm. That's really the guide more than genre, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, how do you tell that story? And to tell that story, the history is necessary, but also how we live is necessary. Seeing what we don't say, but we know. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You write eloquently, movingly, unapologetically about white supremacy and whiteness. I mean, you don't just say racism. White supremacy and whiteness, especially and I'm using your phrase, the savage violence in the South. The Wilmington Massacre, Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, and again in 1971. I mean, you also write a lot about resistance. Was it difficult for you researching and describing these acts of, we would now say, racial terrorism, domestic racial terrorism?
Yeah. But I think I sort of learned, that's, for me, where my graduate training actually provided a foundation, because my dissertation was all about the late 19th century in the South and the relationship between the legal order and the extra-legal violence, right? And so I spent those years being in, like the Klan trials and just see. But I think the other thing, so there's that, but then there's also being a movement baby, where that was a whole lot more violence. And, it's traumatic to come of age and know that there are people who are connected to you deeply, love you, and your people who are in prison for the rest of their lives because they wanted Black people to be free. Mm-hmm. So it's difficult, but it also feels like, well, the least I can do is tell the story, right? That feeling of like, and especially, you see all this, these people who are poisoning all of our water, right? Who are destroying our land, who have everything, and then people who just want, a little bit of, sharing and freedom, who will never, walk in the sun again. And so I think so yes, it was difficult. There's a lot of tears. It feels like a thing that is part of the responsibility. And the responsibility is not just to tell the story, but to try to figure out a way to not tell it such that it feels completely defeating.
Talk a little bit about your being a movement baby, and I bet your parents are very proud of you. Because sometimes you can be a movement child and disappoint your parents.
Well, okay. So my dad, my adoptive father, who was proud of me, but one of the things I'm very aware of, one, he definitely wanted me to move back to Alabama. Mm-hmm. And he wanted me to practice as a lawyer and not just be a law professor. So yes, and my mother is, I think, proud of me, but it's sort of like there's a lot of expectations, though. Mm-hmm. Right? Everything you do has to have a moral and political underpinning to it. It's not like this success is meaningless on its own. That's not what you're chasing. Mm-hmm. Like, that was the sensibility I have. So I feel very an ever-present sense of responsibility. I'm grateful for it, though. There were times when I was like, oh, like everything has to be talked about in terms of, freedom, right? But I'm grateful for it. But I also think that I also want to say that there are ways in which, because of our movement and because my mother became less sort of fully active in the movement, some of the things that I think other movement babies experienced that were particularly difficult, and there was a lot that was difficult, I wasn't constantly experiencing. So I also think that's an important context,
Imani moves around to very many cities in the book, but I'm going to focus on ones that will be show my biases. I'm going to begin with Atlanta. Of course, you come to Georgia and you come to Atlanta. Let's talk about your section on Atlanta.
Yes.
Home of Coca-Cola, Southern hip hop, the Atlanta University Center, Morehouse and Spelman and Clark, Atlanta, Black achievement, Black lawyers, strip clubs, CNN, the Atlanta child murders, and our Black writers who pondered that saga. To Tayari Jones, who's a Spelman sister, Tony K. Bambara, James Baldwin came and talked about the child prosperity, Black poverty in Atlanta that we don't talk about. And I just will mention one thing that you mentioned in the book: 40% of Black households in Atlanta make less than $50,000, while only 20% of white households are in that category. You wouldn't know that because of the brand. So, what do you make of these contradictions and complexities in terms of Atlanta history?
Yeah, so I want to begin by saying I love Atlanta because some of my Atlanta friends are not pleased with me about this chapter.
I know.
But here's the thing, and I really do love Atlanta. I mean, I think there's a reason for over 100 years, Black critics have been coming to Atlanta and trying to figure out what's happening here, right? So when Du Bois is like, okay, we have to be careful because there's a lot of aspiration and growth, and it's magnificent, but we have to be careful not to see what's underneath it. And that, to me, became the focus of the chapter, to see, and it's called King of the South for a reason, that this is the place where all of these parts of Southern culture and tradition come to an apex and reach a climax. And at the same time, when you pull behind the curtain, there's still so much suffering. And that is a lesson that's really important for all of us, because it's also a place that many other people look to as a site of aspiration without understanding what's happening underneath. That is both about, about how this moment, if you step outside of downtown, for someone like me, I had come to Atlanta, I experienced it as luxurious. I do. And I wanted to be honest about the fact that that's not the full story. And moreover, that it's also the case, because I remember this guy in Boston said he was moving to New York and moving to Atlanta because he heard it was the Black New York. And I was like, and he came back and said, that's not the Black New York, things close. And yeah. But I think that there's an allure that actually means that we turn our way from the reality, which is, for example, Black home ownership is lower in Atlanta than many other parts of the South. Right? There's a lot of vulnerability, and the Atlanta child murders were, one, it was a signature event in my childhood, right? It's all Black children who were in the 80s. You were so aware. But it was also it was a moment that so many people wrote about, and it's what brought Baldwin came to Atlanta, because the marketing the city too busy to hate, and it's this is a great aspiration. This is what Black people have always dreamed of, and it was right after the movement, and people thought, and then the complicated feelings about the case itself, and who and what did this mean, and to me, those are the kind of questions we have to actually ask about all of our national mythology. So when I ask those kind of questions in D.C., I think people are more accustomed to it, but also it doesn't feel. I think that hasn't disturbed people as much as asking those kind of questions about Atlanta. But it's really the same kind of question. These sort of national questions about the difference between myth and the reality of how people are living or making do or not making do.
Yeah, I want to say, I'm also aware of my privilege in Atlanta, but every day when I leave my home and drive to Atlanta, I pass by homeless folk on Juniper. And then there are 10 cities right outside the capital. So I'm aware on a daily basis of the serious homelessness problem. The other thing that I'm aware of that is not very visible is this is one of the major sex trafficking in girls place in the U.S., mostly Black girls. And at the Women's Center, we've had discussions about this. This is invisible, but this is really depressing. So I'm happy that you pulled the curtain back on Atlanta in many ways, and that doesn't mean that we also are not aware of everything else that you mentioned. But it's complicated, and it saddens you.
Yeah. Because we want, and it's like, I think it's like so many, we want to believe in all of the magic, right? Like that's what we're hoping for. So it's the dream deferred kind of moment too. So I appreciate you saying that. And I also think, what was real interesting though about some of the kind of people who felt frustrated about the chapter is the thing about the book is it's not a conventional travelogue with genre. Like I'm not going to each place and being like, this is what's great about it, this is what's bad about it, this is the history of the place. It's a work of art, and so each chapter is doing something different in the puzzle, right? And like you could talk. So one example is, religion is all over the place all the time in the South. But for me, North Carolina became the chapter where I thought about religion mostly because it's the place that's described as not that Southern, even though it's wholly Bible Belt, right? Like, and so, to try to open up, to try to subvert things, open them up, and use places to raise bigger questions. And so it's not a kind of representation book, like I'm representing this, it's more like it's an exploration. So
I'm going to go to my hometown, where you went, Memphis, Tennessee, where Ida Wells Barnett, and it's hard for people to believe, I had never heard of Ida Wells Barnett growing up in Memphis. Had never heard of Ida Wells Barnett, who was run out of town, really could have been killed, crafted, as we all now know, that international anti-lynching campaign, went to Chicago. There was the sanitation workers strike, which brought Martin Luther King Jr. to Memphis, and of course where he was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel, which was about a few blocks from where I lived. And also, a little personal reference, you talk about 416 Lucy Street, where Aretha Franklin was born, and I grew up on 430 Lucy, 3 doors down from the Franklin house. So, talk a little bit about Memphis, and I might chime in a bit.
Please. I want you to talk about Memphis.
It was an amazing place to grow up.
It's stunning.
Stunning.
Culturally, it's, I think...
Music.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And it's, so part of the formulation for me in the book is that when I realized, Memphis is part of Mississippi, it's not actually part of Tennessee, right? It helped me get so much. right? Like, because, you hear, and again, there's a lot of really important, beautiful work about the Great Migration, but I'm also interested in the development of southern cities. So that out of Mississippi, Memphis comes. Like, it's a site of Black building, resistance, incredible creativity, right? Artistic. And also, like, what does it mean for me? For me, it was like, what does it mean that, there's Graceland for Elvis, and then Aretha Franklin's home is in disrepair? And what I wanted to say there is, well, there's one, which is white supremacy. There's that thing, right? But there's something else, which is about amazing things come out of little homes, right? That that there is a everyday virtuosity in particular that I was trying to sort of speak to, and I think Memphis was a really beautiful place to think about it. That's part of Black Southern culture. That's not the virtuosity of, like, I'm going to go be a famous person, but in every, that is found, like, to do extraordinary things, right? As a mode of living, right? So that was, but I'll just say really quickly, and then I really want you to talk about Memphis, but, last week, Starbucks in Memphis fired people who were trying to organize a protest. A union, rather, I'm sorry. They fired a bunch of people. And I was thinking, and Starbucks has all their Black History Month logos and slogans, right? And, and of course, King is part of them, and he died while supporting sanitation workers' strike. And it was one of those moments where part of the cost of not telling the history true is that those kinds of insidious moves happen all around us all the time. And they don't not only do they not get called out, but I think they don't get recognized,
If there's a little bit of time at the end, I might say, but I want to just say three things about Memphis. I did not know that people thought Black people were not smart. That's all I knew growing up in Memphis was the smartest teachers. My physics teacher, I had brilliant, segregated school teachers. I grew up with musicians, Charles Lloyd and Isaac Hayes. I had no idea that people thought Black people were inferior. Because of growing up in Memphis, Tennessee, every Black churches, Black funeral homes, Black dentists, Black everything. And so I just, I was stunned when I began to realize what white people thought about Black people, because I knew that we were brilliant. I graduated from high school in 1962, and one of my best friends in high school made a perfect score on the SAT exam, the perfect score, and ended up going to Harvard. But he was, and this didn't seem to be weird. Nobody walked around and said, "Can you believe that Napoleon Williams made 800 on the SAT?" It was like normal. He ended up also going to Harvard Law School and ended up being the NAACP legal defense firm. But this was normal. And so that's what I want to say about growing up in Memphis. It was an amazing place to grow up. Now, does not say that there was not horrendous racism. But I just remember my Girl Scout teacher and my brilliant women math teachers. So that's what I want to remember about Atlanta.
That.
Yeah.
About
Memphis. Yeah.
I wrote a little essay about Florence Tate's memoir, and that was part of it, where she talked about her high school experience. That is exactly what you just described. Yeah. But also, for her, part of what moved me so much about what she said is, she had a very difficult familial situation, and she was like, so school was the place, because now so often we say, oh, well, kids are struggling because what's happening at home, but it was clear that for her, going at school, the idea was you take care of all of the children, and so she could glory in this extraordinary experience with these teachers who cared about her and believed fully in her intelligence, and it was a place she could belong that didn't that actually overcame what was difficult.
I want to say, too, I didn't go to the so-called middle-class school in Memphis. I went to where my father taught art. So I went to the so-called working-class Memphis public school. And so when I talk about my classmates...
But she did, too.
Okay, yeah, she did. Florence Tate is Greg Tate's mother, who also ended up in the movement. So I'm not talking about, sometimes when I say this, oh, yeah, you were over there at Hamilton and Melrose. I said, no, I was at Manassas.
Yeah, that's what she said,
no, okay. So I want to say that. So I'm not,
It's important.
I'm not necessarily talking about children of privilege. I'm talking about regular folk at Manassas High School that produced these amazing folk.
Yeah.
So let's go to Birmingham.
Yes.
Your hometown, and you feel about Birmingham home the same way I feel about Memphis, even though I left there when I was 16. That Memphis still feels like home. So talk a little bit about Birmingham.
I left at 3.5.
Yeah.
But when Romare Bearden in that movie, I think it's in Bearden Plays Bearden, he's like, I only ever left Carolina physically, and he left at 2. And I do think that there's a way that, places where you learn to walk, talk, I learned to read before leaving, and your family that's home. I also think that there was a kind of self-regard that I learned there, a dignity, a self-regard, a sense of my own value that was so essential in all of the places I went, right? And so, it was sort of like the word isn't armor because it was warm. It was like a warm coat around me all the time, a protective coat. And I think it's really important because this is one of the things that people don't talk. I mean, it's obvious to folks here because we're in Atlanta, but if you're in, I think, a place like Philly or New York or Chicago, like people think everybody's family's migrated in the Great Migration. And so in those, my experiences in those cities, people are like, oh, people say, oh yeah, I have some cousins somewhere, but it's like remote often for them, and I always, I don't come from a Great Migration family. I don't come, and we need to talk about that because it has always been the case that the majority of Black Americans live in the South, but you wouldn't know it.
No.
From the public arena, you wouldn't know it.
Before I open it up, one of the things I also really like about the book is the way in which historical Black colleges are all the way through the book. Because sometimes you can write about the South and not mention our schools. So talk a little bit about that decision.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's about my own formation because I think I think of myself as someone who is possible because of historically Black colleges and universities, even though I didn't attend them, and so many ways, right? So one is obviously the intellectual tradition I consider myself a part of, right? That's where, and that is the, Southern Black intellectual tradition. But it's also, it's personal. My mother met my adoptive father at the new faculty orientation at Miles College in Birmingham, and they started dating, and she and my mother's first job was at Xavier. I come from a Tuskegee family. Many of my, so I feel like there's a way in which the schools that feel like they produced me, and my parents had actually been at Yale at the same time and never met. They met at Miles, and because that's a place where they went because they were trying to do something politically meaningful in a way that they wouldn't have encountered each other, right? So, it's the way of move. Like, so for example, one of the stories I tell in the book in Nashville is about my department at Princeton in African American Studies, how I figured out, I was giving a talk at Vandy, but I wanted to visit the high school that my grandmother had attended in Nashville, Pearl High, and because she used to talk about it, but I didn't really know anything about it, and I figured until after she passed, and it was this historic Black high school that sent a lot of kids to Fisk, but also TSU. But I started talking about it at work, And all of a sudden, all these people I work with are connected to Pearl, too. Kianga Yamada.
Famous.
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing. Kianga Yamada Taylor, who's my colleague, her parents and grandparents went to Pearl. Rena Goldthry, her parents went to Pearl. Kianga is from Dallas. Her parents went to high school in Nashville. Rena is from St. Louis. Her parents went to Pearl High. Eddie is from Eddie Glaude, right? His grandmother went to Pearl High. He's from Mississippi. And we're from Alabama. So what emerged is here's this high school that was so special that people were sending their kids there from all over the South. And that's a submerged history. And the way that I have become, so this goes back to this why HBCUs are so important. The way that I have become to understand how important the history of these high schools is because the places where the records of those kinds of schools are at HBCUs. That's where the memory is sustained, right? And so that's like my research side. Like, so one of the projects I'm involved with is this, we're putting together this Black Teacher Archives project where we're collecting all of the journals that Black teachers produced, like through their formal organizations in segregation, where they talked about pedagogy and best practices and all this kind of stuff that were they're amazing documents so that people can use them as research tools, right? So it's like, it's the tradition. I guess that's a long way of saying that. It's the tradition.
I hope you don't mind. I'm going to get off script for a minute.
Okay.
I hope you don't mind. And I meant to ask you if it was okay, but before I open it up, I want you to talk about your having been arrested.
Oh, yeah.
At Princeton University, outside of the South.
Oh, yeah.
And it just shows you white supremacy is alive and well and all over the place. And people in the audience would probably be surprised. You didn't talk about it in the book, but I want you to just...
I'm talking about it in the next thing.
Okay, so just
it's
say...
the Audible original.
Just give that... describe that, which is unbelievable to people.
Yeah.
And then we'll open it up.
Okay. I'm going to give the longer story, too, that I never stated publicly. So I was in the hospital... And I had been in the hospital for 5 days, and I wanted to go to Princeton on a Saturday to my student Destiny Crockett was put together a Black feminist conference over the weekend. I had to get to it. So I was in excruciating pain because I couldn't take my pain medicine because I was driving. And I was driving to campus, and I learned the details later, but the police pulled me over for a suspended license, and I was speeding, and then they said I had parking tickets, what have you, and I asked, okay, can I pay them? No, and then they arrested me. I didn't believe I was a professor at Princeton. That much was clear. They arrested me. They handcuffed me to a table when I got to the police station. And then they said, I said, well, can I pay these fines, right? These tickets. And they said, the credit card machine doesn't work until Monday, so you have to stay through the weekend. And I said, can I call the president of the university? They said no. And then I was able to call, a colleague who was, because I live in Philly, I don't live in Princeton, so it wasn't an easy thing to get, who was able to bring cash, because you could only pay with cash. So, and then afterwards, here's the thing, one, there was the court stuff, right, and the town, and they were so scandalized, and I had lots of colleagues who thought it was just scandalous that I would even mention this publicly, and you were supposed to, it's just all kind of horrible stuff. But then the white supremacists went crazy. So I had to have a security detail around my house. I had threats. People were calling my cell phone, all kinds of death threats, more misogynistic attacks than I'd ever heard, every nasty word for a woman you could ever receive on every possible platform. And at a certain point, the university asked me if they said, we really think you should move out of your house and go to a private location. I said, I'm not going to get out of my house. It's already too frightening for my children, and we're not going to go into. But the intensity of that there were people who try to call me through my phone. At the same time as there's this widespread public opinion, which is like, what is this out of control black woman professor, right? Meanwhile, this happens all the time. All the time. Nobody gets handcuffed, especially not to it, right? The last thing I'll say about it, though, that was fascinating is that, there's not a lot of color in Princeton Township. When I went to my court date, I was like, oh, here's all the black people and brown people. And the courtroom was filled with color. And there was there's a Sanford and Son episode about that? Oh, okay, there you go. I have to check it. I watch old television as like a comfort in this time period, so I will look for that one. But there was a man who was there because his bike didn't have a light on it. And he was doing gardening work, and they told him, and they said, "Can you pay the $300 fine?" Now I'm thinking, obviously this man, if he could afford a light on his bike, would want to have a light on his bike, riding around his bike at Princeton in the middle of the night. And this man said, "I have to work 2 weeks, and then I can pay the fine." And I was like, oh, this is actually the same as in Ferguson. It's the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Same.
Right? That's what they were doing, just hustling people for money. Poor people, brown people, black people in this town. There's INS trucks that sort of roam around the town of Princeton. So there's this fiction, right? That that those play. And the thing that is so insidious is the people there produce the fiction, so they don't. That it's down here, so they don't have to deal with their own racism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's one of the things that my parents always said. Don't believe what people tell you about the North and about how unfortunate you are to be in the South. No. Just forget that. So,
well, I
wanted you to share that because you didn't talk about it in the book, and it's quite possible, that you wouldn't know that. So, and you, how did you deal with that?
It was pretty traumatic.
Yeah.
What I was trying to do in the moment is to use it as an occasion to think through the way the world had worked. Mm-hmm. Like the traumatic part, it was just traumatic. Like it's just traumatic to have people telling you that they want to kill you all day long. It just is. And it coming from everywhere. Like when you don't know, when there's letters at your house, when there are people trying to call you through Facebook, the internet's, the cyber stuff is really insidious, but when you combine that with phone and actual sort of physical stuff, it gets outsized. So it was traumatic. I don't know how much I ever really processed it. I processed it intellectually to sort of think through, well, this is how the world works, and also I got they caught me in the web by accident. Mm-hmm. Right, so now I have to try to figure out a way to expose something through the accident, right? And I think, and this is why I think it is important. They did not think that I did what I do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right. So, which I'm actually experiencing all the time, and I think that's actually an advantage because it allows me to see more about, about.
Thank you
racism.
for sharing that.
Thank you.
We are going to open it up. I have 1,000 more questions, but we want to hear from you all. I think you all wrote questions on cards. Yeah? So that's what we're going to do now. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Also, just really quickly, I have friends out here and family, and I just want to thank y'all for coming, in addition to everybody else, but especially.
Thank you so much. And I am walking around picking up lots of really great questions, so we'll get to as many as we can. If you have a question and don't have a card, my colleague Monique here has blank cards and pens, so just raise your hand, she'll come get it.
This one over here, too.
Yeah, here's one over here.
A couple over there.
Mm-hmm.
Great, I'm just going to start in the order that I picked them up. So this first one says, as a scholar who has studied racism and white supremacy, how do you respond to acclaimed authors such as Zora Neale Hurston and Walter Dean Myers, who relegate psychosocial trauma to individual bullying instead of systemic racism?
Did you, you know what, maybe you should hand the question to me since I don't have a mask on, because I couldn't hear. Could you all hear the question? Did everybody hear it?
Okay, some of
So I'm gonna, okay. As a scholar who has studied racism and white supremacy, how do you respond to acclaimed authors such as Hurston Myers, who relegate psychosocial trauma to individual bullying instead of systemic racism?
So I don't know enough about Walter Dean Myers to respond. I will say about Zora, it's complicated because she was engaged in a lot of provocation, and there are moments, there's texts that are very clearly dealing with, one of which I write about Serafon the Sawani. There's texts that are dealing with white supremacy. There's also a real powerful commitment to not being defined by white supremacy that is part of her work. But all that aside, people who are brilliant geniuses can be wrong on certain questions, to me, right? Like, I think one of the things that we have to be really careful of in this moment where our relationship to great figures is so often one of fandom is that we don't give ourselves space to disagree. Right. And so there are things that Hurston said that I disagreed with. That doesn't change how I feel about her, you know.
So is there a place you didn't have a chance to visit that you wanted to when you were working on the book?
So many places. Because of COVID. There are places I wanted to, like there was a chapter on Arkansas that's not in there. There's a chapter on Houston. Houston comes in at the end, but that I had to take out because I needed to go back. There's some places that I don't go frequently enough to just be like, okay, I was there 2 years ago. I really needed to go back. Yeah, there's a part of me I wanted to think about, and maybe this will be later, like I wanted to think about places where it really is not clear if it's the South, but like Oklahoma and Missouri, like where they're really Midwest, but they have things that are very similar and really get to what are the contours of that. But years ago I said I wanted to write something on the Black Midwest, so I'm not doing a whole book, but I might get to some of that later, yeah.
So connected to that, how did you choose the destinations that you went to? And how did you decide which ones you would highlight actually in the book?
So I chose places based upon feeling like I had been there enough and knew enough and had enough connections to people and events and history that I could capture something that felt true. Right, so it really was. It is a book that is shaped by my own experience in some profound ways. Wait, what's the second part of that question? Because that was important. The second part.
And what you decided to highlight of the places
well,
that you
highlighting,
did visit.
It had to do with the stories, right? So for folks who haven't read the book yet, I like a rabbit hole a lot. Like I used to love to read Alice in Wonderland, and you just go down and you just start going, right? And so there are places that make that easier, right? To just go and some of it is even environmental, like it's like what the land is like that there, right, can make it. Are there, there caves? Is there water there? Is there, what kind of water there? What is the relationships between the rivers and the coastline? And, what do the trees look like there? It literally is what environments allowed me to travel, but still feel like I could come to a coherent place. So it was less, it really wasn't, and I know this surprised a lot of people, partially because of my job, that it wasn't like, I am going to go to these, 8 important, sites that are going to tell you about it wasn't that. Early on, I said, this woman told me I should go to Mount Vernon. I was like, I'm not going to Mount Vernon. I don't want to go to Mount Vernon. I'm just not interested in Mount Vernon. Lots of people have written beautiful things about it. I'm not, I wanted to discover, and the piece about the land is really important, because if you care about the people at the bottom of the social structure, the people who are closest to the land, then the land has to be a character and not just the buildings, right? And so that's another piece too, like the wildness of the landscape in so many places is really important, yeah.
So for those persons in the audience who might want to be writers, what was your writing process?
Oh, that's the worst question to ask me.
And also maybe even you could include some of the other books too.
Yeah. So, oh gosh. Okay, so I do have to write every day. It's a thing that calms me down. And it like helps me get centered. The hardest thing about this book rollout thing has been that I can't write. And I don't write like to put stuff out. Like I just write to like center myself. The process, though, I think this is the thing that I have to say that I think is useful. I don't think A, B, C, D destination writing is what works for me or for many people, and I think that's how a lot of people get stuck. I think I like to put together the pieces of information that I'll need. And so, like when I was writing about the history of Lift Every Voice and Sing, which was the most fun book to work on, because I could just spend hours looking in black newspapers, historic black newspapers, and look at like, this grade school had their eighth grade graduation ceremony, and the girls wore blue corsages and the boys wore white boutonnieres, and they sang Lift Every Voice and Sing, and then this person played Handel's Messiah, and so I was collecting information like about how the song was enmeshed in black rituals, but it was also really pleasurable to read through these events and stories. And so the collecting part, you can get a lot of the work done through the collecting part, but if you sit down and you're like, what am I going to say about this? That's a lot harder, right? But then if you have this beautiful array of documents that you can say something about, that's different. Or when I wrote last year a profile of the writer Gail Jones, who had a new novel come out after 20-something years, and I just spent so much time enmeshed in her stories. Like I read everything I could find of hers. I was sitting on the floor. And that freed the pen up, right? Like reading for me is an engine for writing, and I think we separate them too much. But like you read something, and something, you scribble down an idea, that's writing. Yeah.
So one person wants to know, what did you mean when you said you were a movement baby?
I mean that my parents were members of the Southern Conference Education Fund. I grew up with members of SNCC and the New African Peoples Organization and early prison activism, really early prison, like in the 70s, and protests against repression at prisons like the Atmore-Holman prison in Alabama, prisons in Houston and Mississippi, and around, and also were connected to people in global liberation struggles, anti-colonial movements and the like. So people in, Guinea-Bissau, Chile. I remember hearing stories of like, the coups in Chile, the military. I mean, it was radical movement, not the sort of the 54 to 68 conventional story of movement, but the more radical branches that were present through that whole time, but that continued through the 1970s. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is a really interesting one. It's going to be interesting to see how you answer this. Looking into the future, what would you want the scholar to write if they were writing your biography, or to get out of the transcript of this conversation? Isn't that an interesting question?
It's a beautiful question.
Yeah.
I might start asking that of people. So I'm going to steal your question when I'm... That's going to sound so trite, but for my biography, I just...
Who asked that question? Oh, okay.
That's a good one. Out of the transcript of this conversation, I would like people to get how deeply I admire you and I'm grateful for you. I can be shy, but you're the person who the very first person I said, who do you want to speak to on the tour? You're the first person I said.
Oh, that's so sweet.
That, I just want people to know that I tried. And that it was for us.
Let me ask you, who would you want to write a biography of?
Who else would I want to write? Okay,
I mean, like if it was one person.
Okay, so the first person I ever wanted to write a biography of, I'm sorry, I'm going to answer this with a story, but was Sylvester. The
New Orleans. That's Sylvester. Which is
the Sylvester, the 70s disco icon. Yeah, right.
Yes.
And then and as it turns out, there was already so this is the story. So I wanted to write write a biography of Sylvester's. The person I was talking to said there's already got to be a biography of Sylvester. So I go on Amazon, but I did buy it. And it was brilliant. And I was like, this is so good. Who wrote this biography? Turns out it was a teacher I'd had in college. And so I wrote him, and I said, first of all, I'm sorry I never came to class. And so I did. But he was the person who had introduced me to reading Patricia Hill Collins. Because I did all the reading, I just didn't like to go to class. And so I thanked him for that, and so that was like my entrance into imagining biography as a expansive form, which is why I wrote, and that was necessary for me to write Looking for Lorraine, in addition to
That's my
wrapped
favorite in person. So we could, Lorraine Hansberry.
She said, but Wrapped in Rainbows was so important for me too. That's why it felt like that day. I was like, this is a sign that I'm supposed to do this work. But yeah, and I'm glad that there's more and more work. There's so much work to be done on Lorraine. Yeah, but I don't know who else. I don't have a person in my head right now. That's an interesting question.
So I was going to ask you about this, and someone does. Do you believe that critical race theory will heighten the concept of supremacy among whites? And how should we combat it? I mean, and I think you mean combat the resistance to critical race theory.
Well, first of all, what people are talking about is not critical race theory at all. So it's the strangest thing. Like it's one of those things. You know how when little kids, when they're losing a game, they knock over the board and this is what critical race theory is, right? Because they're not actually taught, which is a tool. It's a critical tool for understanding how race can function without being explicitly invoked, right? But they're talking about teaching anything in history that has anything to do with black people. That's what they're calling critical race theory. And then saying that's bad because it makes white people feel bad. Well, one of the questions, so you don't want to change your behavior so that you don't have to feel bad in 2 generations and 3 again. I mean, it is an interesting, so it's very hard to engage on their terms. I don't know how one engages on their terms besides insisting, no, we're going to read these books and we're going to do this work and we're going to continue to do, to invest in our history. I mean, I don't know, and also to call it out for its moral failure, right? What does it mean when you don't want to give your children the capacity to be moral actors? Because that's essentially what it's saying. Right? I think we have to reframe. What are you afraid of? Them becoming fully human? I mean, that's what it sounds like, right? So to me, I don't have an answer on their terms because I think it's a trap. Yeah.
So a person in the audience says, I love the point you made about school being a haven as a white male. How do we bridge these gaps?
I think it's like the same thing, which is about being fully human. and being vulnerable, right? I mean, so I believe in the beloved community. I believe in our capacity, but that it is not an easy thing to achieve in a society which so deeply stratifies people on the lines of race, gender, sexuality, class, national, all of these things, right? So to create it, it's more than goodwill. Like spaces it has to be more than goodwill. It has to be sharing of power and resources fully. It has to be being vulnerable and acknowledging fallibility. It has to be moving through difficult moments. And my experience has been, and I'll be completely frank, I wish it weren't so. I wish it wasn't the case that my experience has been that it is very difficult for white people to share power in institutions irrespective of the stated will. And as a consequence, it makes it hard to actually get to trust. Mm-hmm. I don't want it to be that way, right? And I don't, and you have to, and the other piece I think it's really hard often, I think, for white Americans in particular, understand that people of color, and in particular black people, have to be deeply self-protective because of how vicious the society is. So what is seen as like a kind of defensiveness or an unwillingness to be open, those are survival skills to function. And so, the question then is not to say, well, why, to be like, well, how do we get, why is that, no, how do you create a condition where that isn't essential? And that's hard work because, that's how the world is organized, right? For black people, if you express vulnerability, that becomes the thing often that you get attacked on. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not, and that happens over and over again, and often with people who express such goodwill. And so I think, so I don't have an answer, obviously. If I did, I probably wouldn't be doing what I'd be doing. I'd be institution building, but it's an observation,
Claire, I think we are at the end of our time. Am I right?
Yes, but I personally could listen to y'all talk all night, so thank you so much.
So you want to close us out? Do you want any final thing to say, Imani?
I would just say, the last thing I just want to say is I thank every person who has purchased a copy of the book. Since it means so much to me, like I can't actually adequately express it, and I don't mean it in a trite way. I really mean it deeply, and I do hope that you can experience it in the spirit in which it was written, which is an invitation to reconsider, to see this place with fresh eyes, with loving eyes, but with honest eyes, and find something. I hope that you can find something useful in it. So.
Thank you so much to our wonderful speakers, to our wonderful audience. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of your questions. Please be safe going home, and to the Atlanta University Center Woodruff Library, we so appreciate your partnership on this event.